right. I am now joined by Matt McManus, who's here so often. He should do that Simpsons gag about bringing his own mic, and Sam Adler-Bell, who has not been here for a while. He was on to talk about Fauci like a year ago. How you guys doing?
Good. Great to be here.
I have 200 essays to mark, so not quite like the 9th circle of hell, but definitely like ranging around like 5, 6. Could ease down into 7 depending on how things go.
Ben, I think the last time I was here was when Matt and I were on to
no, that's true. That's true.
With Danny Besner, which I'll just say this can't possibly be more painful than debating Danny Besner. So I'm excited to get this going.
Yeah, fair enough.
That's some loving. That's loving. That's set in love.
Set in love. All right. Fair enough. Yeah. No. And that totally steps on the joke that I was about to tell, which is that Matthew Sitman isn't here because of our strict policy against platforming papists. But in any case.
I thought you were going to do another Simpsons joke and be like, we're allowed to have one Matt, not two.
yeah. It's the No Matt's Club. We're allowed to have one.
Right.
We are very happy to have Sam here. I should say, for anybody who didn't see him on either of those previous occasions, when he and other Matt were debating Danny, and I was sort of awkwardly pivoting back and forth between moderating and participating, and then before that, we were talking about Fauci. Sam is a writer, and he is also the co-host of a really excellent podcast called Know Your Enemy. I actually just randomly listened to an episode of that last night. I was gonna find like the old one where you guys had talked about some of the Fred Ahmari stuff, and then I couldn't find it. And I was just looking through old episodes, and there was one about William F. Buckley running for mayor. I was like, that sounds fun. I'll listen to that. So.
Yeah. That's a fun one. That was one with Sam Tannenhouse, who's Buckley's authorized biographer. So he's got a lot of interesting stuff.
I also have to say, Sam, you produced my favorite piece of journalism last year, which is that big dive into the post-liberal right that you did for the New Republic. You know, the giant one where you interviewed Nate Hochman and a couple of the others. It was. Yeah. I remember sitting there being like, damn, this is fucking comprehensive. I'm not sure that I'm not even needed anymore, right? I'll just slam the door shut and say everything that needs to be said about this, descriptively at least, is done. So,
well, that's certainly not true. You're needed, but I'm happy to hear you like that piece because I think it's the best work I did last year too. I'm very proud of it.
I really liked it.
Well, you certainly are needed because here's a question that could not be asked of Sam because I don't think he's willing to read this. Joe in the chat wants to know, how's that Dave Rubin book?
I mean, I described it as like profoundly superficial, which seems paradoxical, and it kind of is, but it's really the only way to actually account for it because while you're reading it, you just kind of drift off and you're like, oh yeah, so we're here to talk about a God-shaped hole, but we're actually talking about another hole, the asshole. This
is kind of a quote from the book.
Yeah. And I'm paraphrasing. And then there's another part where he's talking about Patreon, and he's like, the day I got rid of Patreon, I got wasted on Patron. Zing! And you're like, oh yeah. And then like your thoughts.
It's like a Derrida joke.
This is exactly what I'm getting at. Like your mind just starts to wander reading it to like some really like deep places. You're like, well, what does it all mean anyway? Why am I doing this? What other choices have I made in my life? So profoundly superficial is the only way I can describe it, right? Oh, that's a hard question, actually. I would say better than James Lindsay's book because it's less obnoxiously frustrating. In terms of its intellectual substance, like James Lindsay is, kind of Homer Simpson to Barney Gumble, That might be unfair to Barney, actually, because Barney is usually implied.
Yeah, I was trying to follow the metaphor there, and you lost it.
Okay, well, you get what I mean, right? Okay, so he's like, dumb Homer versus Homer when he gets the crayon taken out of his brain. Right?
There we go.
So, okay, that's a better Simpsons joke for people who still follow that. Lindsay is crazy and crackpot, but every now and then you're like, oh, there's like a semblance of something like an argument here, and I'm pretty sure he's actually read a book in his time. In fact, he's probably read a lot of books. Dave Rubin, I'm kind of like, oh, look at that. He was able to Wikipedia Hannah Arendt. That's really very impressive. Or whoever wrote the book, Wikipedia Hannah Arendt. Good for him.
Yeah, I mean, I get the sense more with Lindsay that he has actually like read numerous books and torn pages out and like plastered them up on his wall, a la Beautiful Mind, and like, you know, drawn little connections between them, diagramming, you know, like how they're related to each other. So, you know, it's
I think that Charlie Day and It's Always Sunny clip, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then it's like, this is where it begins, you know, Hegelianism turns into Marxism, which turns into communism, which turns into communo-fascism, and then it goes back to being totalitarian Sovietism. It's all part of the plan, man.
It's funny that diagram he posted recently that had his sort of like spiraling up, you know, dialectical historical development thesis. I was like, this is not the worst thing you've ever done. And he's clearly, I mean, the joke I made is that he's becoming a Hegelian despite himself. Like, if you're using Hegelian methods to, like, you know, deliver your devastating critique of the left, like, you're going to get seduced at some point, you know? I mean, he's not really rejecting the method even if he thinks he's rejecting the, you know, the outcome.
Oh, definitely. I mean, one of the things that I found frustrating about the book is that fun one.
I thought this was one of the best things he's produced. I mean, I can't really read it, and I didn't look at it very closely, but.
Well, the thing is, it reminds me of those old Kojève lectures, you know, lectures.
Exactly. No, that's exactly what I thought of.
Same kind of growth. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, yeah, we probably read that around the same time. But anyway, yeah, I mean, all joking aside, Lindsay's book is definitely more intellectually grounded than Rubin's book, which is basically just a series of complaints mixed with some really bad butthole jokes. And, you know, I laid out my reasons for why Lindsay's book is wrong. I won't do it again. But let's say if he did happen to become a right Hegelian or a Vogelinian or any number of other things, it wouldn't surprise me because he's kind of all over the place in terms of his own intellectual convictions.
Yeah.
Could go anywhere.
Well, I will say that Matt's doing yeoman's work by reading these books. Me and other Matt give ourselves the out of saying like, oh, we're only going to read like, you know, the actually interesting, sophisticated right-wing literature. And that's a real, you know, that's a prerogative that we take, and somebody needs to read the bullshit. So thanks, Matt.
Hey, listen, it's a cross I willingly bear this Easter weekend. Right?
Fair enough. So I do, you know, speaking of Easter, I do want to talk about Sohrah Ahmari and get, you know, kind of set up this debate that we're going to watch a little bit. So the, you know, part of the context here, and I will say, I actually don't remember if I knew about Compact or not when I first asked you guys to if you wanted to do this particular breakdown. Like I had like kind of vaguely had the idea for a while, you know, that this might be one that we would do at some point, but then it became slightly more timely because Ahmari, who is one of the debaters in what we're watching tonight, plus Matthew Schmitz, who I know much less about, but seems to be, you know, have Ahmari-like worldview, and Edwin Aponte, who's kind of the odd man out, I guess, is, you know, something like, you know, I don't know exactly, has some sort of lefty, post-left, whatever, something like that, you know, sort of outlook. Just founded this magazine, Compact, which and included, I should say, many people on the masthead who I'm more fond of than anybody. You know, like a couple people at least on that masthead I'm more fond of than I am of those, and who I don't think share all of their politics. But they just can't, you know, started this online magazine, Compact, which is very like slick, I guess, if that's a word you can use for an online magazine. It has like high production values, and it kind of like came out with like weirdly amount of a splash, right? Like there was a New York Times write up of it, you know, the day that it was announced, which is not typical for new online, you know, sort of quasi intellectual magazines. But in there, right? So I wrote something about this for Jacobin. which we might still have the graphic for this, but the maybe not. Yeah, okay, I don't think we do. But anyway, it's called like you were just kind of talking about your up market or down market niches. Had the most down market of titles. It was stop trying to make right wing social democracy happen. It's not going to happen. And
I mean, I thought it was one of your best personally, because I felt that way more times than I can count, really.
So, but basically what they said is they want the strong social democratic state, but also they wanted to stop libertinism, whatever that means. They want to defend community, local and national, familial and religious, against the libertine left and the libertarian right. And that, I think, last part, not so much the strong social democratic state part, but that part, I think, gets to what Ahmari is debating this other much more moderate conservative David French about in the debate that we're about to watch. So, Sam, do you want to set us up a little bit? Like, who are these people and what are they fighting about?
Well, you covered some of it. This was 2019. Basically, what happened was, yeah, I guess I should tell a little bit about Ahmari and French. Ahmari is a immigrant from Iran. He grew up in Tehran. Came here when he was pretty young. I don't know exactly. He went to college here. He was a Trotskyist when he was in college. Then he became a neocon, kind of, secular conservative. From that, during that phase, he got a job at the Wall Street Journal, naturally. He also went to law school, then the Wall Street Journal, and then over time, he converted to Catholicism and has since also converted to a more populist, integralist, curious, I would say, hardcore social conservative politics, abandoning the libertarian aspect of sort of mainstream conservatism in particular. So the funny thing about Ahmari is he's sort of like gone through like the history of like the kind of trajectory that a conservative goes through over the course of like 50 years in the 20th century, from Trotskyism to neocon to whatever, in 5 years, or 10, I guess. He's not very old. He's like 36 or 37. And now he's arrived at sort of being this kind of like lead pugilist of the new right, kind of populist, Catholic tendency, pro-Trump, pro-state, believes that we should legislate morality. We should use, the administrative state to enforce our moral orthodoxy, as the left has been doing theirs. So that's Ahmari. And David French is, I mean, the inciting incident for this debate is that Ahmari wrote this this kind of very in his way pugnacious attack on what he called David Frenchism in First Things.
It was very subtly titled "Against David Frenchism" in 2019. So
and he treated French as sort of the like ideal avatar, the kind of like archetype of a traditional conservative, a social conservative, but one who is still kind of attached to the idea that, like, we have, if the government shouldn't, intervene, that we should create sort of that social conservative values will flourish if we have like liberal pluralism. He's a classical liberal. I mean, he describes himself as a classical liberal. But I mean, it's true. Ben, you said that French is like a moderate conservative, but I mean, he's really a hardcore social conservative. It's just that, like, in the Trump era, because he, for one thing, I mean, this is the sort of submerged thing that will become clear when we watch the debate, is that it's really about Trump to a significant degree, because French never went along with Trump. But David French's career, he's at National Review, but his career, most of what his work has been, is legislating on behalf of religious liberty, and with a great deal of success, like a lot of famous kind of cases about, where religion can be allowed to exist in public life have been legislated by him and his partners. And so he doesn't think of himself as a moderate necessarily. I mean,
Right.
you know, he thinks then this, we'll get into this, but he basically thinks I've been in the trenches, you know, fighting this rear guard effort to maintain places in what is perhaps we would agree, they would both agree, a fallen culture for religiosity, Christian religious morality to flourish. But their disagreement is about, you know, how viciously and with what level of civility and with what level of comfort with state power do we prosecute that fight.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the sense in which French seems more moderate, I mean, even though, I mean, look, I mean, just in terms of like whether I like these people, I mean, this is kind of, you know, I don't know, Godzilla versus Mothra stuff. Like I think it's you know,
I think they both have virtues.
You know, French is a you know, that's
but yeah.
You know, I mean, whatever. Like, you know, like I think I actually do think they both have virtues, but I think as like
I'm serious,
as a, you know, no, I mean, I actually do think that's true, but I think that like as a
French and Ahmari are Mothra and Godzilla.
Yes, as people, I think they both have virtues. I think that I think as like sort of political actors, right? I mean, like they're both pursuing things that are you know, odious to me, right? That they
want them to lose.
Yeah, exactly, right. So, but they are pursuing different things in a certain sense. And so, what I mean when I say French is more moderate, and you know, since I think that phrase like classical liberal is you know, pretty flexible, right? You know, like what people mean by that. So I think like to be, I think in a sort of like rough and ready way, like, you know, the sort of like, so David French means things by defending religious liberty we don't like, but it is within a certain conception of like liberal rights, right? So like he has so like, you know, think about like these cases where it's like defended like I don't know, like the you know, the cake shop that doesn't want to like sell wedding cakes to gay people, right? I mean, like the sort of defended the right of the cake shop owner to make that decision is the sort of thing that French is considering, which, you know, I mean, again, you know, we could have a whole discussion about why we dislike that, but that is a certain, you know, and why this isn't the way we'd like to think about how liberal rights should work, but it is a conception of how liberal rights should work. Whereas famously, one of the things that, you know, that Ahmari and French have really disagreed on is whether in some way or another the power of the state should be used to stop drag queens from reading to children at libraries.
Right. That's like the inciting incident for this whole thing is Ahmari freaking out on Twitter because he saw an ad for a drag queen story hour at a library in Sacramento and just lost his shit and said something like, there's no David Frenchite way to like, you know, deal with this problem. He says like the only way is through. And then in the piece, he said, I think this is kind of the essential line from the piece, or at least it's kind of literary high point. He says, I added, the only way is through. That is to say, to fight the culture war with the aim of defeating the enemy and enjoying the spoils in the form of a public square reordered to the common good and ultimately the highest good, which will not be achieved in his vision by, you know, litigating these little fights over religious liberty over and over again. You got to do something a little more drastic.
I don't know if I ever told you this, but I actually inadvertently came into the middle of this because David French retweeted an article with some commentary I wrote about Sohrah Ahmari and this piece.
I didn't know that.
Well, I made an argument that Sohrah Ahmari's Christian theocracy would actually be an anti-Christian theocracy because of the level of inauthenticity that we found in it, and I invoked Kierkegaard and a few other people. And David French retweeted me being like, this is absolutely right. Kierkegaard says that this is going to lead to inauthenticity. We can't do that. And I was like, no, don't. I don't want to be associated with that.
The Ahmari French McManus debate.
That's right. That's right.
But I do remember thinking like, well, whatever. At least the one I find less noxious. It's the one.
Yeah, I mean, in context, right? Because like, because I mean, like that basic division, right? Like, is the way that well, the culture war should be fought, and like to be clear, I think when Ahmari says fighting the culture war, he means like I think that's a phrase people use in different ways, but I think what he means, right, is like actual like I mean, I think David French, in a certain sense, is talking much more about a literal culture war, right? You're sort of like fighting about how people should live, in a way that at least theoretically isn't exactly supposed to be decided by the state. But Ahmari's talking, and however vague it is, which by the way is one of my longstanding beefs with a lot of these people, that there are like different versions of this, and a lot of them are good writers, but they have but I just often feel really exasperated. It's like, no, tell me exactly what you want to do.
There's a coyness.
Yeah.
Well,
like it never quite seems to be spelled out, right? It's like, what does this actually mean, right? Like, what do you want to do? What's the policy? How do you think you're going to achieve it? That's not really spelled out, but whatever it is that Ahmari wants to do, it's not defensive in the way that like, letting bigots run cake shops as they please is defensive. I mean, it's in some sense going on the offense and like stopping other people from doing what would even under the French scheme count as like exercising their own liberty.
First Amendment rights. Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah. I want
go
to say
ahead,
though, I do think that they're taking a more offensive approach. Oh, sorry, Sam. I didn't even see you because my internet's lagging. But I think Adrian Mueller, sorry, who we talked about a little bit last time, Ben, has a new book out, Common Good Constitutionalism, that I apparently have a review coming out of tomorrow. But anyway, what's interesting is Ahmari gives it a plug in the back, and he more or less likes everything Mueller does. And they're very explicit in that, or he's very explicit about what he wants. And actually, this speaks to kind of the point you made in the article, Sam, because you kind of pointed out there that there's really no aspiration to achieve a certain kind of democratic majoritarianism to vindicate this project, because as you put it, they're kind of too weird to actually aspire to anything like that. Edwin Mueller seems sensitive to it, even if he doesn't really come out and just say we're never going to be that popular. He sidelines democracy and says it's not the most important thing in the world, and says that his judges and the administrative state would have no problem just implementing his vision of a common good constitution, which includes some things that some leftists might actually like, right? Certain protections for the environment that didn't exist before, stronger protections for labor unions, a kind of minimal welfare state, but also regulates morality in a way that's highly anti-liberal and that would discriminate against trans, LGBTQ people, migrants, you name it.
Well, and it would have to be.
Yeah, and I mean, it's very much supposed to be a top-down enterprise. Right?
Yeah, I mean, and it could only be, right? I mean, this is something I pointed out in the Jackman piece, that it's like, I mean, look, in the last couple decades, Ireland has legalized both same-sex marriage and abortion by popular referendum. That's Ireland, right? Like, there are.
My family's Irish. Be nice to Ben.
Well, I mean, I'm not saying anything bad about Ireland. I'm just saying that, like, I think it's an uncontroversial matter of fact that there are more Catholics in Ireland than the United States proportionally, right? Like that so if your goal, just to be kind of crass about it, right? And this feels like hyperbole, but we're back to the vagueness about the goal, right? Is to sort of impose a right-wing version of Catholic social values, right-wing understanding of Catholic social values on the rest of the population, then even in a place that would intrinsically be much more favorable to it. Right, you're clearly not going to be able to do that democratically in 2022. I don't know what the plan could be, right, for doing that in the United States.
Oh, I think he's pretty overt about what the plan is, right? I mean, in a number of articles, Mueller said that the goal is to work from within liberalism, particularly within the bureaucratic and administrative state, to gradually undermine it for the purposes of establishing this new integralist regime. Let's just use that term, right? And then to gradually gain enough currency amongst legal elites that they'll think that this is the right approach when it comes to things like constitutional interpretation. So now you legitimate this kind of takeover of the bureaucracy under the auspices of constitutional law. And again, Sohrah Ahmari is there in the back cheering this on. And I think that this is really probably the most concrete the vision has become so far. I mean, I imagine it'll continue to be updated because it's not a very long book. It's only about 200 pages or so. But But it is quite frightening when you realize that they're not really being shy about just saying, you know, if the majority of Americans don't want this, then, well, that's really too bad.
Yeah, I mean, there's an argument here. I mean, conservatives have made the argument for a long time that like the administrative state and the judiciary is actually where power resides. The administrative state being the executive branch, the bureaucracy. That our legislation. It's very hard for voters to actually get their will heard. And there's totally like an analog of this on the left, where we think like, well, these institutions are really broken. The legislative process doesn't really work. Whatever the preferences of the people are, they don't necessarily get a hearing, and they certainly don't manifest as legislation. And so we should use whatever bureaucratic means, executive means are available to do what is right, what we believe is right, what our movement believes is right. And so there's an extent to which the conservative movement for a long time was always like dismantle the administrative state. Like, it all went wrong when the bureaucracy was built, beginning with Woodrow Wilson and then sort of, coming to its full flourishing in the New Deal era. That was the wrong turn. That was the abandonment of democratic liberty. And we have to get rid of the administrative state. Now, these guys are saying, well, that's not going to happen. It never did. It wasn't going to happen. We should use the tools that are available to the left, and the left has been using for all these years to prosecute our agenda. Why should we unilaterally disarm when, from their perspective, like the executive bureaucracy is this like, woke moralizing institution which pursues a concept of the good, even though it pretends like it's not pursuing a concept of the good. And so they're just saying we have a different concept of the good, and why shouldn't we play their game? Why should we unilaterally disarm? So there's a logic to that. I think also, just to set it up for the listeners, the watchers, this debate, the debate, which basically starts with the article in First Things. David French responds in National Review, sort of saying like, you've mischaracterized me. It's a straw man argument about what I stand for and what I've done with my career. It kind of like, I think Ross Douthat in his column about it said like it was like a full employment program for conservative pundits, because like every single person wrote about this thing. It clearly did identify a fissure, like a real conflict within this kind of weird coalition that is the American conservative movement. And so everyone had something to say about it. And as I'm sure we'll get to when we start watching and responding to it, and I'm sure Matt will have very interesting things to say about this too, it really is to a degree a debate about liberalism as such.
Yeah. Like,
should the right be liberal? And Ahmari says, no, the whole problem is liberalism. And French, of course, says, no, we must be liberal.
Yeah. And I mean, this is a good reminder, because I think I will own this, right? I think I have a history of like really underselling how many people are willing to frankly take that position, because like so actually Matt edited this anthology for Palgrave called Socialism and Liberalism, Mortal Enemies or Embittered Kin, or maybe the other way around. And it was and in my essay in there, I kind of like made this sort of half jokey comment about how there's certain kinds of basic liberal premises that everybody sort of agrees with, like unless you're like, a neo-Nazi meeting in a church basement somewhere, or you're like you're leading around a band of child soldiers in the conflict zone or something like that. There's some level in which, whatever your wacky interpretation of it is, you sort of accept these premises. But I think some of these people, right, like are I mean, that does make it interesting to me, right? That some of these conservative intellectuals are willing to just say, nope, actually no, right? Like that that like we don't believe in any of that, right? Like that this is that last time I was talking about, we were talking about Vermeule, and in his piece in Compact, his initial piece in Compact, he has this line where he's sort of bashing, the old, dead consensus-y stuff, and he says, and he has this phrase where he's like, sort of mocking the stuff they like, and he says free markets, free speech, and the free use of drones. It's like, wait. Let's roll back the tape and talk about the one in the middle, right? Like that's, you're just going to openly say that that's bad too.
I want to say just one other thing before we move into the debate, though, because I think that Sam's absolutely right that at its core, this is a debate about the liberal heritage of the conservative movement in the United States, with the liberal heritage being defended by people like himself, George Will, Jonah Goldberg, like a handful of others, and the kind of illiberal vanguard now being the kind of intellectual cutting edge. And I do want to say that I think it's quite telling that most of the interesting ideas in the American right, not the worldwide right, but the American right now, are coming from this illiberal faction. Like if you think about George Will's book, The Conservative Sensibility, it's a well-written magisterial book, but it's pretty boring, right? It doesn't really have a lot of new things to say. These people have lots of new things to say, at least in an American context. But the other thing that I want to really stress is that one of the things that unifies both the classical liberal and the post-liberal variants of the American right is a kind of antipathy or wariness about democracy. And Corey Robin has written some very good things about this, right? Because one of the things that you see is that early on in the Trump movement, there was an effort to kind of gloss up a lot of this with a kind of populist veneer by suggesting, the real people or the majority of the people are going to overcome elites. And you still will see quite a bit of that when it comes to like the window dressing. But when you actually look at the intellectual substance of the work, as Sam pointed out in his own article, there's really nothing about how we're going to actually form a concrete majority. And there seems to be acknowledgement that the United States, at least in terms of its overall population, is going to become more liberal over time. And so they're always leaning in now, both in the liberal and the populist wings, or the post-liberal wings of the Republican Party, to the most anti-majoritarian and elitist features of the American political structures: courts, the administrative states, the executive branch, right? And it's deeply concerning in a lot of ways, because of the anti-majoritarian way that people are elected in the United States, they might actually be able to seize control of them, even if that's what a majority of the people don't want. And I think that's what they're really hoping for.
Yeah, maybe, right? I mean, it's an interesting question because, like, I think it's certainly true that people who are like insane conservative ideologues like get appointed to courts and like make bad decisions, make decisions that like cause lots of suffering, and that there could be more of that because of this, right? But also, like the Supreme Court like is clearly a political institution, and it's not it's not, and I don't think can afford to be entirely indifferent to popular opinion, right? I mean, that isn't to say they won't make unpopular decisions. They do, right? But I think, it would be, I don't think it's like, I don't think they're making decisions in a state of sublime indifference to like how much outrage they're going to cause, etc. So how far, judges who are inoculated to this stuff would sort of go, go balls to the wall in pursuit of, Vermeulenism, is an interesting question. Like, I don't pretend to be able to answer that a priori, but I mean, like, I don't, I think there probably are some pragmatic constraints, on how fast that could possibly be.
Yeah, and I want to point out, just in terms of creative ideas, right? For a long time, the kind of arch left liberal saint of American jurisprudence was Ronald Dworkin, right? I did my degree, my LLM in law, wrote about him. I don't agree with Dworkin about everything, but he has a lot of nice things to say. Vermeule's latest book basically says Dworkin was exactly right to criticize originalists when he said that they're completely misguided and thinking that they aren't enforcing a moral viewpoint. Everyone enforces a moral viewpoint, whether it's a left liberal one or a right liberal one, or common good constitutionalism. So conservatives should just drop the veneer and have judges that enforce what really is a much more robust and much more conservative conception of morality. Why hide it anymore, right? And it is a very creative way of taking somebody like Ronald Dworkin, who would hate everything that Vermeule stands for, and say he's methodologically correct about this, so let's just take the tools he gives us and put them to anti-Dworkinian purposes, right? Very imitative, very smart, very, very dangerous, very worrying stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I don't want to delay us too much, but I agree. I think that, but I mean, I think that the left would also have critiqued originalism that we have for a long time as not really being original. Like, it picks and chooses when to rely on.
Our first Jackman article was on that, actually.
Yeah, so I think I've read that. Yeah, so like the fact is that like the left has a critique of the sort of normative jurisprudence of conservative legal movement, which is that like it's kind of the same. It's that you've been legislating morality. You haven't really been doing this kind of purely procedural or historical analysis of what these words meant at the time and what they mean, what they meant to the founders and blah, blah, blah. And so originalism isn't on particularly strong grounds anyway,
No. And
certainly not for the left in sort of opposing, the post-liberal arguments, because I don't believe in like a fully neutral proceduralism as the way that politics manifests. I think that's also an ideological illusion. And so how we articulate our criticisms of the post-liberal arguments is actually like interesting and complicated, which hopefully we'll get into when we
absolutely. Yeah. I would just say I remember when that Vermeulen article first came out. I actually remember really liking Eric Levins's piece in New York Mag, "No Theocracy and Progressivism Are Not Equally Authoritarian." And he doesn't put it quite this way, right? But I mean, the way that I would kind of think of the argument that Eric's making that piece is like, there are certain respects in which neutrality, like moral neutrality, is impossible because like there are certain kinds of like big structural issues about where, like there is no neutral position. Like you're taking a side no matter what decision you make. That's true enough, but there are also other aspects of morality, right? About how you're going to live your life, etc. Like what Rawls would call your life plan, on which it really is possible and very desirable, for the state to remain neutral, which is
precisely what Ahmari wants.
Exactly. So
that's worth noting. Just before we get, all these guys are very attracted to a well-known German jurist called Carl Schmitz. By the way, I should say is a very compelling critic of liberalism, right? I don't want to deny that. Also a member of the Nazi Party who had horribly anti-Semitic things to say. But he was amongst the first.
Really a land of contrasts. Carl Schmitz, a land of contrasts.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah. Although honestly, if people have to pick a Nazi to read, I think they'd have a more interest in fruitful time reading Schmidt than Heidegger. So I'll that.
Yeah, no. Spend your time reading political theology rather than maybe Being Time is a good book, but definitely don't go to like contributions. Anyway, the point I'm getting at is I'm sure we'll get into this in the article. If people really want to know where the root of a lot of these problems began with conservative jurisprudence, and Sohrah Ahmari and Vermeulen both kind of fall into this category as people who came up through law schools, he's really someplace that they should look.
Fair enough. All right, let's get started.
Yeah.
Who are concerned about the direction of conservatism and its relationship with politics in the United States today.
This intro is really
We at the IAG are extremely grateful that both of these people made themselves available at our invitation to join us. I was quite frankly shocked that they agreed so quickly to be.
Normally, I would remain seated in a sort of inobtrusive moderator style. But this is a big deal. This is the thrill. What was it? The melee at CUA. The melee at CUA. Thank you. Yes. That's copyrighted, by the way, royalties to David Frenchism Limited. All right, no, I'll sit down. It is my great pleasure to be here with two gentlemen whom I've been reading profitably for many years, maybe more years in the case of David than Rob, 19, but, and already has 2 children. He's the most pronatalist, but if you're here tonight, or if you've stumbled on this via live stream, or if you're watching the YouTube highlights 20 weeks hence, this is an argument about the future of conservatism, and particularly social and religious conservatism, in an age of arguably increasing secular hostility to traditional religious faith, rising populism of various forms and varietals in Western Europe and the United States, and of course, in the age of Donald Trump. And my 2 discussants are both, I think, from the perspective of, let's say, the normative reader of the New York Times, radical religious conservatives. I think that's fair to say from the as am I suppose, from that perspective. But they have what appears to be a fairly profound disagreement about a great host of things related to the future trajectory of conservatism, Christianity, social conservatism, and so on in the US. And I think I'm just going to start by asking Sohrah the question that I know is on everyone's minds here tonight, which is Habsburg or Stuart? No, that's not, sorry. There's going to be a lot of monarchy jokes from me directed to Sohrah, and a lot of mild anti-Protestant banter directed towards David, so I just want to warn everyone in advance. So, Sohrah, since you made this...
I mean, you know, you're in a place where people have a fair bit of money when you're making European monarchy jokes.
For First Things a few months ago. Start by telling us what is David Frenchism and why are you against it?
It seems to work. Well, thanks to the IHE for having us, and for Ross for moderating, and David for joining as well. Since this is what I think will be the first meeting of the CUA Catholic Integralist Club, and all of you are members, including David, just for having walked through the door. I think we should begin with three Pater Nosters for the intention of the Holy Father. I'm kidding. No, I did bring, in all seriousness, I did bring David a gift because I dragged him into a debate. And it was a necessary debate. I'm glad that I did, but I brought him some Kentucky bourbon, just in the sense to first of all, thank you for participating in the debate, and also to thank you for your service to the country, and
trying to
for
keep up
your work on behalf of religious liberty, and your work on behalf of religious liberty, and because we're going to talk as two patriots about the common good. We both care about the common good, and these days you can't talk about the common good without some bourbon in you. So, anyway. What is David Frenchism? I would
Decadent
define
leftist.
David
This is from
Frenchism
Scotland.
as a program for negotiating Christian retreat from the
America first, Ben.
from the public
America
square
first.
into a safe private sphere that liberalism, kind of totalizing, overweening, aggressive liberalism, would have us retreat into, a kind of readout of various sorts. And I'm not prepared to retreat into a private readout or a private sphere, and so I oppose David Frenchism.
That was shockingly pithy.
But I mean, I could go on about what inspired.
He's gone on. He's gone on.
No, we'll let pith carry it, and then I'll say, David, do you recognize your own views in that terse description of David Frenchism?
You know, I feel the same way about that terse description of David Frenchism as I felt about the extended description of David Frenchism in First Things, which was you torched a mighty nice straw man there, Sohrah. The fact of the matter is, and throughout my career, I have aggressively utilized the levers of American classical liberalism to not just maintain the presence of a Christian witness in the public square, to extend the physical presence of the Christian witness into some of the most hostile places in American higher education. I've done that relentlessly, and I've done that, I hope to, at the same time, even though as anyone who gets to know me in a short amount of time, and in the shortest amount of time knows I'm a fallen human being and I don't always live up to my ideals. I also try to do that in a way that's respectful of my opponents, recognizes their humanity, and also recognizes that often even some of their worst actions are motivated by good intentions. And so in that circumstance, I have gone into places far from this caricature that Sohrah painted of me having an airy above it all mentality. I've been absolutely on the ground in many of the most hostile places of the United States to a conservative, small O Orthodox Christian witness, and have not only maintained the Christian presence there, I have been a part of expanding the conservative cultural witness there, and even resourcing it in places that sought to deny it resources. And so what I thought was interesting about this first salvo is my experience of classical liberalism and the instruments of classical liberalism in American life is that they are the best antidote to the illiberalism of the left. that they provide a powerful weapon against the illiberalism of the left, and even more so than directly confronting and beating people in court, they also provide a powerful weapon of persuasion to sort of that great cloud of witnesses who are observing from afar, who don't know quite what to think. And they also want to know, who can I actually like in all of this Sturm and Drang of the American culture war? And so my approach from the beginning has been to aggressively, offensively, but not offensively, offensively use the instruments of liberalism to expand the place of Christians in places that do not want Christians there. And so the idea that I am in any way, shape, or form an agent of retreat or surrender is completely false. It's a product of this weird Trump era that says that I'm an agent of surrender unless I get on board with him. No, I just have a new enemy in him also. And so that's Frenchism.
Before the rebuttal is rebutted, I think it's useful maybe to have a definition of terms for us to work with. What's your working definition of classical liberalism?
I would say it'd be essentially the values and principles modeled by the American founding and its major founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Declaration of Independence, all operationalized, both in the main body of the Constitution, but also in the Bill of Rights and the Civil War amendments.
Now it's your turn.
Well, here's what I mean by the retreat of a Christian vision of the good under the French's model. And I'll try not to use that term too much. You'll remember.
Too late.
You'll remember, I noted in the piece just in a sort of elusive paragraph that all this was sparked by, I saw an ad for.
I do just want to say that if you title something against David Frenchism and then go on to say that basically your opponent is the one who's responsible for everything that's wrong with the conservative movement, trying to back down a little bit from that might not necessarily be the wisest or the most sensible course of action. I mean, what's also interesting about this is French does seem to be taking this pretty personally, right? Like, it didn't begin with like an opening philosophical or political monologue. It's like, I have done this. I have been at the front lines of this. I have seen, henceforth, I know best. So I imagine this is probably, I know where this is going to go because I've watched parts of it before, but this is going to descend very badly pretty quickly.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. Watching it again, just seeing how fucking pissed French is, like, just out of the gate.
Right? Just
he's like, I really fucking hate this twerp. Like, take your fucking bourbon and shove it up your ass. It's funny. Like, I actually think I think that neither of them, you know, unfortunately for the listeners and watchers, neither of them represent their position on these matters particularly well in this debate, because they just end up like, squabbling. But that's nonetheless very rich, and you see kind of the id of both of their arguments coming out when they aren't, doing them carefully on the page. So it's worthwhile in that way. But yeah, that is kind of the one thing that strikes you right away, is that like Ahmari kind of like tries to be a little magnanimous. French doesn't allow him to, and we're off to the bitter races.
Well, I mean, I'm Canadian, right? So I'm kind of polite by not just compunction, but by like religion, right? But I don't think that you could, if you title an article being like against Matt McManus in any kind of public forum, and then invited me to something to debate
against Matt McManusism.
Yeah, McManusism. Yeah. Then like, I don't even know that one bottle of whiskey would cut it, right? There need to be at least like two, and one of them had to be buried.
Well, I need to know the brand, I mean, to know whether it's whether
Bushmills, any kind of Bushmills.
Yeah, it'd be hilarious if like he it's like he got home and it's like, after all that, this is like wild turkey. It's like, what the
rebel yell. I think the other thing that's
fucking Johnny Walker. What?
Yeah. Well, I actually don't remember what I was going to say. It is just, I was going to say that there's the other thing about Ahmari's critique is that he says quite explicitly, the line is, civility and decency are secondary values. Like, one of his complaints about French is not just his political philosophy, but it's his demeanor. Like, he thinks that French is a pussy, and that like
Right.
the conservative movement is pussified by French's philosophy and his sensibility. And so, like, there really is no way for them to go into this debate. And Ahmari has made the argument that like politics is about enmity. You know, it's about enmity, which is, as Matt has already identified, getting to the Schmittian element. But like, yeah, no, this can't be a friendly debate. There's a funny thing I think that goes on throughout too, which is that Douthit is totally incapable of moderating like a truly acrimonious debate. Like, he keeps trying to be like, we're all pals here, we're all conservatives, we all want the same things. But no, like, because Ahmari's attack, as Matt said, is like it's on his person, it's on his philosophy, and it's it's on his values.
Yeah, for sure. I was just gonna say, I mean, it is really like, I can understand saying, I mean, look, I think it's correct to say civility, and whatever the other one is, our secondary values. Although, I think we also overdo that one on the left sometimes to no good end, right? I mean, there's sort of like anti-civility takes that just sort of end up being like, valorizing being an asshole for no particular reason. But
No, I think that's the thing to keep in mind here is that Ahmari is taking the Bernie bro position in this in the old 2016 debates about whether you have to be nice online.
I think though that
I was just going to say though, right? Speaking of 2016, it is a little weird to think that like a major problem with the American conservative movement was that everybody was so nice and polite and gracious during a debate that was held during the third year of the Trump presidency.
Yeah,
but that's the thing, is that French hates Trump. He thinks Trump is parasitic on the goals of the conservative movement, and so that's and Ahmari doesn't. I mean, the thing that we didn't even say is that like Ahmari at the end of the First Things article, he says like he does this insane ventriloquism of Trump, right? That is like laughable, where he says, let's see what he says. He says, with a kind of animal instinct, Trump understood what was missing from mainstream, more or less Frenchian conservatism. His instinct has been to shift the cultural and political mix ever so slightly away from autonomy above all toward order, continuity, and social cohesion. He believes that the political community, and not just the church, family, and individual, has its own legitimate scope of action. He believes it can help protect the citizen from transnational forces beyond his control. I mean, this is always what pro-Trump conservative intellectuals do, but like it's particularly absurd. I mean, the sop to reality that he gives is to say that it's like an animal instinct, which of course is true with Trump, but he's not an avatar of political cohesion.
Almost none of that has anything to do with either Trumpian theory or Trumpian practice, right? I mean, that's the last pit about the protecting people against transnational forces at least sort of echoes some Trumpian rhetoric, although, we can argue about how much it echoes anything that actually happened in the Trump presidency. But like the rest of that doesn't even echo Trumpian rhetoric. I mean, like that's just like
a lot of them evade that though by talking about, again, this kind of Trumpian instinct. So he's almost kind of Hegelian instrument, right? Whether he might not know what he's doing, but nonetheless fate is called upon him to do this, right?
Yeah.
But I want to say though, I think that what Sam said about this kind of macho posturing is actually quite important, because if you were to take a kind of a feminist line in this, you really can see the display of two very different kinds of masculinities, both of which have been extremely important within the conservative movement. Because French came up during this very Reagan kind of era, where the kind of masculine posturing that one would associate with the conservative movement was somebody who was genteel, tolerant, but within a certain threshold, clearly patriotic, and to a certain extent militaristic, in the sense that you were kind of this benighted warrior who would actually go out and fight for your country. And Sohrah Ahmari very clearly is articulating a different conception of masculinity that's not genteel, that's kind of scrappy, instinctual, guttural, which I think is ironic, because he's not really like that at all, personally.
Of a real connection with Trump, right? That's because Trump is, not. Trump is somebody who's like, in some ways, the furthest you could possibly get from like traditional ideas about masculinity, but nevertheless, is still seen as an avatar of like some kind of version of it, and certainly it's not bound up in quite the same way with like with at least not with the same kind of ostentatious patriotism, right? I mean, like that he was doing, in 2016, right? He was.
I mean, didn't he hug the flag? Wasn't that in 2017?
Yeah, he was like beefing with like Gold Star parents and talking about how he liked the pilots better who weren't shot down. I mean, like this is pretty blatantly like breaking the rules of conservatism. Of like the version of conservative worship of flag and country that had already existed before then.
Well, I think this is something where we have to bring up something that's really important, right? Because Reagan was actually a president who embodied kind of conservative emphasis on continuity and order, even if Reagan did enact a kind of revolution, at least in terms of the political rhetoric that he adopted. Trump is another recognizable conservative character in the sense that he presents himself as an agent who's allowed to transgress precisely because he's a winner and everyone else is losers. And there's a lot of attraction on the political right to that kind of figure if he, and it's almost always a he, emerges at the right time. And you can really see Ahmari pushing for that, right? Why not be transgressive? Why not try to establish order precisely through a little bit of disorder, right? Why not be mean and nasty and go for broke? What did Sam say, right? We can enjoy the spoils of victory if we get that. So there's really this kind of rhetorical posturing that's going on here that we know explodes later on in the interview or the debate where they talk about French's military record, which is still my favorite part of that. So
let's keep going.
A library in San Francisco. I saw the ad on Facebook, and it just set me off. Now, whether or not
Drag Queen Story Hour.
I think I have painted actually a fair description of you, but certainly in the response, you lived up to the description that I had painted, because you kind of poo-pooed. You remember, David, on a podcast, what Drag Queen Story Hour is. You said, quote, "That's the threat right there. I just don't get it." Now, that made it sound like Drag Queen Story Hour is a small phenomenon and a not very big of a threat. In fact, it's a global movement. It has 35 chapters in the U.S.
35 whole chapters.
Well, hold on.
Years from now, we'll say first
US
they came from RuPaul,
in,
then they came
13
for the
states
drag queens of New York, and then
these events aren't small events like 20 parents. They often draw hundreds of parents.
Yeah, that is worth maybe underlining that, like, that there are 35 chapters in the U.S. That's I don't know how many how many cities are there in the U.S. Like 40, right? So it's like they're like that's probably about how many public libraries there are. So there's 35. It's like everywhere.
yeah, take a gas to go from LA to New York, right?
Yeah, it's just such a weird, like, I mean, whatever. Point to David French. I think 35 whole chapters is I mean, if you start from the premise that drag queens reading to children is like an abomination and a threat to civilization, for some reason, then that's I don't think that Sohrah is making the case that it's like a very big threat.
Well, Ahmari is kind of an odd person. I read his recent book, The Unbroken Thread, which actually had good moments. I was going to say, like, if you wanted to read a kind of discount iteration of Confucius or Andrea Dworkin, oddly enough, you could do worse. But it opens with this really strange sci-fi scenario where he's thinking about his son a couple of decades into the future. And he's like, my son is pretty successful. I've given him a lot. But his life is spiritually vacant because he's in an open relationship. He's not all that committed to his marriage. He and his wife have decided not to have kids. And the attempt is to kind of catastrophize a little bit. And you're like, really? This is like the worst thing that's possibly going to happen. Your son is rich, getting laid pretty often, and he's decided he doesn't want to have kids. I mean, as in terms of setting the stakes for the need to recover this auspicious tradition that we've let go of, I'm not really sure this is the best way to go about doing it. It comes across as kind of waspy, but he's an odd guy that way. So it doesn't really surprise me that drag queens, setting up in 30 different American cities would be of vital interest to him. Right?
Well, I mean, the thing is that's interesting about this is it's such a preview of the panic that we're going through now with the groomer shit with the right, where they, this was just like for Ahmari, like it's exactly the same impulse as the idea of like exposing children to sexuality and non-traditional gender norms and stuff like that. It's just that he had picked, a particularly unpersuasive, kind of boogeyman, drag queen story hour. Nobody's ever heard of that. Like,
nobody's ever heard of it. It sounds kind of innocent and innocuous because it's got story hour in it.
But you can see the sort of like seeds of it working on a much larger scale once they suggest that like Disney is doing this, or like teachers are doing this, or every single, daycare is doing this, camps are doing this. So while I think that like, French wins the point there on the grounds of like, is this even that widespread? Once the conservatives figure out through, Chris Rufo's, Fox brain to suggest that it's this much more widespread thing that is reaching into your homes and into your schools, you can see how it works better. It's more persuasive.
Yeah, fair enough. I will. So I do want to get back to the debate, but I will concede this to Nucelli in the chat. You probably do owe us 45 seconds of explanation, Matt, because that is a confusing thing to say. Confucius or Andrew Dworkin?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I think that there are probably two reasons why both of these people and others appear in the book.
He dedicates like chapters to like different figures that are representative of one of these questions that he imagines his son asking him.
I see.
Yeah, and okay, so long story short, I think part of it is just to kind of perform a kind of broad-mindedness, right? Suggest that he's not necessarily as dogmatic as you might think, because look, there's St. Augustine and Confucius and a radical feminist all in the same book, right? But the other thing I think that is important is he's trying to kind of operationalize certain left-wing arguments made by anti-sex feminists and kind of turn them to conservative purposes. And this is a very common kind of trope on the right, where, if they see something that they think they can use, they'll innovate and put it to their own uses. But it's very much against the spirit of somebody like Dworkin's work, because obviously one of the last things she wanted was return to a kind of misogynistic, male-dominated, integralist society, right? But you can read the book if you want to see his own take on it, right?
He uses Dworkin to suggest that sex is a public matter.
Okay, there we go. That makes sense. All right.
And some children. And it is a threat, and it is demonic, because by the description of the organizers themselves, it aims to, quote, promote a glamorous, unabashedly queer role model for kids. In Britain, you can find footage of a drag queen story hour reading hour in which the drag queen teaches children how to twerk. And he says, this is to an audience of kids, and you can hear like kids and babies kind of giggling. He says, you crouch down into this position, your bum sticking out, and you just move your bum up and down like that. And the parents laugh, and the kids kind of giggle unknowingly. So to me, that should raise a 5-alarm cultural fire. A 5 sense that we have in a cultural crisis and a moral emergency. That blasé attitude, that's it, just a few chapters. That attitude rebuked David, earned a rebuke, David, from the closest thing you have to a supreme pontiff, Albert Mohler.
No, that is false. That is completely false.
But he did. Okay, but he did rebuke you. He's the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. He said, and he was addressing David on his radio show. He said, David, if that doesn't represent a cultural crisis to you, then I simply have to press the question even harder. Answer honestly. What then would it take for you to recognize a cultural crisis? And then pressed by a writer for Slate magazine, Mark Joseph Stern, who asked, well, what would you do about Drag Queen Story Hour, David? You said, well, I wouldn't do anything because it would encroach on, quote, local control over libraries. Oh, heaven forfend. So it's not a description just of, the difference is not just a matter of how to respond to the cultural crisis. It's whether or not, first of all, we recognize that a culture in which children, whether it's voluntary or not, people can do terrible things voluntarily, are brought into a space in which drag is performed. And drag can be, look, I live next to a drag bar, literally. Like it's next to me on the same block in Manhattan. Does it bother me? Do I take armies of young Catholics with pitchforks? No, it doesn't bother me there. But when it comes into interacting with children, with all its subtext of transvestic fetishism, yeah, I'm going to be concerned. Because I live in New York City, I live in the real world, not in a kind of idealized big Christian community. And in that setting, that poses to me, and I would say even to the parents who take their children for whatever reason, a kind of cultural crisis
I mean,
that needs to be taken seriously.
you're
And your
really
responses
leaning into
to
it heavy when
kind
you
of
say
chuckling.
being an affluent Manhattanite is the real world, right? And I understand that that's a rhetorical trope, and who knows what the real world even means when it comes to like the median voter, but you're really leaning into it then.
Well, there's an interesting thing going on here where like Ahmari, lives, in the belly of the beast, so he's exposed to the real, as he would say, demonic forces at work in like libertine leftist spaces. And I think it's later in the debate. I don't know if it's something they wrote or if it's in this debate, but he actually dings French, who lives in Tennessee, like chooses to live surrounded by fellow co-religionists, for not really knowing just how bad it is, which is kind of a funny thing. And I think actually we talk about it on our podcast a bit, where I think it actually comes up a lot that the guys who are like these, freaky, culture warrior obsessed, like kind of like feel that there is this like overweening woke behemoth that's, grinding people down and, demanding secularism from everybody and stuff. They all choose to live in like major metropolitan cities surrounded by liberals. And so, yeah, you might feel like you're not well represented there, but like, why don't you go live in Tennessee in the small town or wherever that French lives? Like actually pluralism still exists in this country. You're just not choosing. You're choosing to expose yourself to this stuff that's going to make you really fucking pissed off. He lives next to a drag bar.
Sometimes that's really explicit, though. I mean, like if you read Mueller's latest book, right, and a couple of other articles, one of the kind of bits of rhetorical and personal ammunition he uses to vindicate his positions is by constantly saying, "I teach at Harvard and I'm surrounded by leftists all the time, and liberal types," and there is a kind of value that they get from this, of course, because it demonstrates a degree of authenticity and lived experience that you can't get by being insulated in the so-called monolithic bubble, right, where everyone still is Christian and lives like it's the 1950s, right? But I think that it's a really insincere kind of claim to or appeal to authenticity, precisely for the reason that you brought up, Sam, which is that if you don't want to fucking live there, you could just buy a place that's not near the
in
bar.
Ahmari's defense, he actually has left New York. I think he did a "Why I Left New York" piece a few months ago.
Sure. But I mean, it's also like a weird appeal to authenticity, because it's like normally I thought the way this was supposed to work is that like people who live in big cities don't understand what's really going on in the world, right? They don't understand what it's like for real Americans, and it's also very weird that he just okay, it's libraries, so that makes it sound like the stakes are petty, and so I get that, right? But like also the way the way that Ahmari just dismissed localism, right? Like that's also like a kind of weird thing for a conservative to do, that like local control over something is like a nothing value for him.
I don't think it is necessarily a weird thing, though, because again, the kind of ruralism that you see displayed in American conservatism is a really potent force, even going through people like Barry Goldwater or even Ronald Reagan, right? But that's never been a particularly ubiquitous feature of the kind of Catholic tradition that Ahmari is moving out of, right? Which is always claimed to be Catholic, right? In its orientation, universalistic, right? And has grand ambitions. And if you read the writings of a lot of the peoples in that tradition, going from Joseph de Maistre through Newman and whatever, there usually is this kind of apocalyptic grandeur to a lot of what they're talking about. That you can see sometimes appearing in almost caricatured form in Ahmari's work, where he'll say things just like you're saying now, right? Look at the drag show that's going on in this little library in God knows where. Isn't this a sign that civilization itself is going to crumble and fall apart, right? So I really think you can see, again, the kind of differences in upbringing between the two of them.
Yeah. All right. Let's keep going.
How many chapters and so forth. Suggests that you don't recognize the crisis to begin with.
I do not recognize Drag Queen Story Hour as a cultural crisis of great import in the United States of America. We have a nation of 320 million people. It is a free nation. Throughout the course of our history, we have had cults here and there, polyamorous communities here and there, people who are doing bad things that I disagree with. It is a byproduct of a free nation. These are choices people make in a free nation. The other day, I was driving to drop my youngest daughter off at a sleepaway camp in a little town called Crossville, Tennessee. It's a town in the middle of nowhere. It's between Nashville and Knoxville. It's heartland America. And across the street, kind of sort of close to the camp, is this odd-looking hotel. And I didn't know what it was, but I was intrigued because there hadn't been a hotel nearby. We might want to stay there when we were going to drop our kids off. And we were asking a family at the camp, and they said, "Oh, no, you don't want to do that." It's like, why? It's a swinger hotel in the middle of Crossville, Tennessee. Now, two things. One, I'm upset by that. There shouldn't be a swinger hotel in the middle of Crossville, Tennessee. The other thing is, this is a nation of 320 million people, many of whom we're all fallen. Majority, maybe, possibly, I don't know, only God knows, don't have a relationship with Jesus Christ. That's the crisis, okay? It manifests itself in different ways, Drag Queen Story Hour being one of the least significant. Here's a more significant. Tens of millions of Christian American men addicted to porn. That's infinitely worse than Drag Queen Story Hour. I mean, there are problems so for now. But then the question that I asked about Drag Queen Story Hour is, because this came up, what do we do about it? Because one of the things that you'll know and you'll understand if you have been dealing with the problems that Christians have been facing in public spaces in the United States of America is that we have fought long and hard to secure, beginning with a case called Widmar v. Vincent in the early 1980s, the right to viewpoint neutral access to public facilities to propagate our particular message. It's one that thousands of Christian churches use now to provide access to public facilities. The spread of the gospel is facilitated in an immense way by viewpoint neutral access to public facilities. This is an unquestionable absolute fact, and it is one that we have fought for. Now, I don't like that 1,500 people in a year go to Drag Queen Story Hour, or 2,000 or whatever. It's less than the weekly attendance at my church in 1 week. I don't like that. I like to see every drag queen in the United States of America become to a saving relationship with Jesus Christ. I am not in any way willing to upset the constitutional order and to provide governments the ability to engage in viewpoint discrimination against disfavored organizations for the sake of dealing with that menace. You have to consider a larger superstructure, and the reality is that you cannot take these things on a case-by-case basis and establish rules that say free speech for me and not for thee. Because then you better be sure that the me is always in charge. And in this country, the me will not always be in charge. The thee will be in charge sometimes. And if you have wrecked legal institutions, even on relatively smaller issues, because you hate this gathering so much, it's got to change, it's got to go. There's a price that's paid there. And there's a price that has ramifications far beyond any sort of benefit gained by not having these 35 chapters active in 35 public libraries in the US.
I think the typical...
I'd like to say something here, actually, because this kind of speaks to what I was getting at earlier on about democracy, right? Again, you can really see the kind of difference in terms of their dispositions because of the errors that they came up with. Because with French, you really can't see a kind of confidence that the conservative movement can win hearts and minds through normal democratic procedures, like it did in the Reagan era, right? Where conservatism, there's no doubt about it, right, was hegemonic and kind of overturned the hegemony of kind of FDR-style New Deal liberalism.
Reagan won 49 states.
Yeah, I mean, it was a blowout, right? That's the only way to describe it. With Ahmari, you can really see the fact that he's far less confident, oddly enough, that his viewpoints will be popular enough to ever achieve that kind of hegemony, right? So the only way that he can conceive of establishing the kind of moral consensus that he's looking for is by using state power. Because French says that
there's also something weird about that, right? Because you sort of think it'd be the other way around. Like if you have a
yeah, you would.
because if you weren't confident that you'd win a popular majority, then like you'd think you'd go, whatever, like if anything, you'd go like Rod Dreher, right? The Benedict option, you just secede from the larger society. And it seems like, and just make sure that you can continue to do your own thing unmolested, which is precisely what David French's point, right? That that's how he sees his project. Whereas like, yeah, if you were confident that you could, win a popular majority, then I could understand a little bit more, being willing to, break down all these constitutional protections that you'd worry about having to protect you if you're, if you think that you might be a minority in the future.
Oh, absolutely. And you saw features of that with Reaganism as well, right? What I was referring to was more the idea that kind of institutional break wouldn't be required in the 1980s, because it was so clear that the culture had shifted in a right-wing direction. And a lot of conservatives during that era spoke with confidence about the belief that they didn't need to kind of fundamentally tinker with the institutions of the United States, because they were going to win the culture war over a long enough period of time anyway, by winning hearts and minds, right? And eventually getting everyone addicted to Fox News, through the 1990s. Again, with Ahmari, you really see this conviction that that's not possible, I think, any longer, right? And I certainly think you see that now when they're turning to the most anti-majoritarian features of the United States to try to impose this moral viewpoint on everybody, almost as an act of desperation in some ways, to kind of counteract the rising tide of liberalism in libraries and big cities, drag shows, you name it.
Say XYZ is already under assault, things are already terrible, and therefore we can't can't use the public power to at least
What public power would you use, and how would it be constitutional?
Well, certainly, I mean,
I would love for somebody to answer that question one time. What public power, how is it constitutional? And if it's not, do you believe it's worth changing the Constitution?
Well, I could see, for example, a hearing held on what's happening in our libraries, in which Senators Cruz, Hawley, and Cotton make the head of the Modern Library Association or whatever sweat, as they know they can. And what does that do? It sends a cultural message that we're up against this. We're going to fight this because it's obscene. I don't know. You can pass at the local level ordinances. You can organize.
Ordinances at the local level are subject to constitutional review.
And we'll fight it, and you'll fight it for us. But we're actually going to do it.
No. No. I will not fight for the limitation of the First Amendment.
Let me mention this, so that because XYZ is already under assault, then we should expect or accept the next assault on sort of moral norms. So I want to quote to you.
But you still have not said
I want to quote to you
what you would do about Drag Queen Story Hour besides hold a legislative hearing.
Well, hold on.
Go ahead, and then I'll.
In 2006, you wrote this about gay marriage, David. I know you've changed your mind, but at the time you wrote, quote, "Gay marriage changes nothing. Churches can still speak out on sexual immorality and can still choose not to perform gay marriages. And the gay couple down the street in no way threatens our straight marriages." And certainly for the couple in Oregon, it did pose a challenge to their marriage, David. So I know you changed your mind.
I wrote at length about how I changed my mind about that.
I know
right?
You changed your mind, but my point is, if in 2006 you weren't woke to the threat that the 2006 version of the cutting-edge sexual revolutionary step will mean for us, then maybe you should sit this one out, because there are a lot of young people who are looking at what's happening.
Maybe I should. I'm never going to sit out the defense of the Constitution. Never. Okay, so the bottom line is, you are telling me you've still not said what legal doctrine you would change to deal with Drag Queen Story Hour. Say one thing.
Local ordinances
that are subject to constitutional review. So viewpoint neutrality in the allocation of resources of public buildings should go away.
I do think that's funny.
No, so you believe that viewpoint neutral access to, say, high school classrooms, to auditoriums by churches, to Bible study groups, gone.
No.
Okay.
That wouldn't be the case.
Well,
yes, it would.
Let's try stepping back a tiny bit from Drag Queen Story Hours to pornography.
We can never step back from Drag Queen Story Hour. It will dog me.
No, but I think, I think David's question to you is fair, right? But ultimately, implicit in Ahmariism, if I may, is the idea that essentially social conservatism or traditional Christianity, whatever category you want to describe, requires for its flourishing a different interpretation of the Constitution than the one that has prevailed at the very least since, I apologize for the echoes, at the very least since the school prayer decisions of the 40s and 50s. Do you think that's a fair, I mean, you're imagining local ordinances that would effectively viewpoint discriminate in ways that I think Supreme Court justices in 1877 might have supported and would not today. Is that fair?
It was 9-0 today.
We also have public decency laws that we actually very often, a lot of them are still on the books. They're just not aggressively prosecuted. In other words, the Bible study may not run afoul of public decency laws in a way that the drag queen story hour might. Obscenity laws, which again we used to have on the book and were only judicially defanged not that long ago, a generation ago.
Couple, how's?
I'll just go ahead and tell you, constitutionally, the typical drag queen story hour would not violate even old school obscenity laws that would be past constitutional.
When has that been tested? Drag queens interacting with
You're feel free to test it, and you'll find that I don't surrender, and will fight against viewpoint discrimination in public accommodations, and you'll lose 9-0.
Okay, go to war for drag queens.
But
I'm going to war for the First Amendment. See, this is, I want, no. This is absolutely fundamental to this debate. It's absolutely fundamental. We live in a nation of enduring ethnic, religious, cultural differences, a continent-sized, multi-ethnic, multi-faith, multicultural constitutional republic. There is no circumstance under which any political movement in this country can create a superstructure where the people that you like always win and the people you don't like and you think are bad are always going to lose, and you're going to always like that outcome. And if you try to do it, you'll rip this place to pieces. The only way this place survives as a united country is if we apply 18th century solutions to this 21st century division, rediscover the First Amendment of the United States, rediscover religious freedom, rediscover commitments to due process, rediscover all of the instruments of change and all of the instruments of argument that we have used for generations to make this country a greater and more just nation. It does not mean it's ever going to be perfect. And we're always going to have people who do things in it that disagree. But you know what? I think one part of my Christian witness to this country and my Christian mission to this country is to live a legal version of the golden rule. I'm going to fight for the rights of others that I would like to exercise myself.
Probably as good a place as any place. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sam, what's on your mind?
Oh, well, one thing I think that I had this thought before French gave what I thought was his most spirited defense of liberalism as such, and pluralism as necessitating liberalism. So I'm interested to hear Matt talk about that too. But before that, I was thinking about how there's really truly a generational conflict that's playing out here. French, in terms of the culture war, for the conservatives really feel like they have been losing. They've been losing and losing and losing and losing for a long time. The only thing that they've ever tried to do, from the social conservative critiques of the mainstream conservative Inc., they would say, we've been voting with you guys all this time. The main thing you've been promising to do is overturn Roe. It hasn't happened yet. It might happen now, but at this point, this is that's been the thing. And they say you gave up on gay marriage, the normalization of homosexuality. You gave up on, the sexual revolution. You gave up on this. You gave up on this. You gave up on this. And so, but French has lived through that, and his approach to living through an era of retrenchment from his perspective of conservatives losing in the social and cultural realm has been to become a sort of realist. What can we do? What can we win? What can we hold on to? What kind of juridical strategies? What kind of wrenches can we throw into the gears of the machine of the progressive behemoth to slow it down and make sure there are still these sort of spaces where we can live our religious lives? And he thinks like it's annoying that this upstart kid doesn't appreciate what they did and what they had to go through. Ahmari is coming to this with fresher eyes and saying, well, what did all that do? You've been doing this for a long, long time, and the landscape looks pretty bleak to me. Your strategies didn't work. I know that it implicates like your whole way of life, everything that you've dedicated your career to. But look, man, it didn't fucking work. I know that I don't know if this is helpful or if it was antagonize the audience too much, but I do think that there's a way in which these debates on the right have analogs with the generational debates on the left, where it's like the Bernie youth socialist, democratic socialist, social democrat part of the Democratic Party says like, well, why shouldn't you listen to us? Like, you've been doing this for a long, long time, and these kind of neoliberal economic policies haven't been replaced. And we've got the energy, we've got the verve, the moral clarity. And there's this critique of the old guard, which is like, you guys are scared. You've lived through, from your perspective, an era of, you lived through Reagan, when it would seem like all was lost. Then Clinton won, so you could make an argument that like that was necessary. All the triangulation was necessary to like claw back, any kind of wins for the Democratic Party. And they just think, and I have often thought in the arguments with like older Democrats, even progressives, like they're scarred by their losses so much that they can't see that we might be able to do something radically different if we all just stopped, being so, terrified and like, and willing to compromise. And Ahmari is taking up that position on the right. He's like, your strategies haven't worked. Why should we listen to you anymore? And so it's a debate, between a radical and a realist, a radical and a moderate position in terms of means.
I want to say that I absolutely agree, except I think there is a bit of a tonal disparity between democratic socialist people like myself and what you see on the American right. Because think about something like Michael Anton's United 93 election, right, which was kind of a touchstone piece for the Trump era. There really is this sense that there's a kind of apocalyptic failure on the part of the conservative movement. And the only way to kind of invert that or reverse it is by electing somebody like Trump. And there's this feeling that everything has kind of fallen away in the face of liberalism. Generally speaking, when it came to a lot of people on the Bernie left, I think there really was also the sense that there's been a period of loss, right? In the sense that neoliberalization is carried on without any kind of really breaks being imposed by Obama, by Clinton, let alone by Bush or Reagan. And we need to do something in order to stop it. But I do think that there was less of a apocalyptic sensibility, except maybe in some parts of the environmental left, and more of a kind of optimistic dimension to a lot of the rhetoric that you saw surrounding this. There was always a bit more of a kind of cynical realism underpinning a lot of these transitions to Trump, even in people like Ahmari, where they said, where he said, if we don't do this now, when are we ever going to get that chance again? Whereas I don't think you really saw something comparable to that with Bernie, where people were like, this is our last chance to get democratic socialism.
I'm going to push back a little bit, actually, because I think, I have to say, I can actually remember times when people did kind of have a little bit of that tone, and maybe in a less apocalyptic way, just because I'm a very mild-mannered person. But I think I said things that were like, which I actually still think are true, right? That like this is like the best chance that we're going to get to like advance social democracy in America more quickly in like a long time. Which I still think is true. I actually think it's a historic tragedy. I don't think it's like done, right? Because it didn't happen, right? But I do think it was a huge chance of a kind that is not going to come right back right away. And I can certainly think of people who said things that were like much more dramatic sort of versions of it, right? I think like, I don't know, like I remember like Matt on Chapo, saying something once about how it sort of felt like the last exit, you know, um, before I don't even remember what he said exactly, but like, um, maybe it was sort of climate flavored or something else, right? But like before something really bad, right? So I do think that there might be a little bit of that sense, maybe not as widespread,
Well,
right?
let me rephrase this, right? I think the difference is that the democratic socialist left in the United States has never held power and never really conceived of itself as holding power. The closest that you get to a kind of nostalgia for the past on the American left is for the Great Society era, right? Roughly running from like FDR to Johnson, right? But even then, most democratic like socialists would say that wasn't enough, right? Whereas with people like Anton and even to a certain extent, people like Ahmari going way further back to the medieval era, there is this sense that once we were in power, right, everything was going well, everything was fine. And the cultural tides have turned against us. And so what's required is this return to something that we had before. So this real feeling of loss or even something being taken away from you that you see in a lot of these kind of rhetorical pieces that I just have never really seen in the democratic socialist movement, understandably, because I mean, you can point back to Eugene Debs. I see a few people making nostalgic comments about that, but no one's sitting there really saying, everything was peachy with FDR. We just need to go back to that with a handful of exceptions.
So I think that's a good point in terms of the like affects that are mobilized by the populists on the left and the right. But in terms of the like institutional conflict within the conservative movement and the movement of progressives or the Democratic Party, the analogy holds up there better because actually the social conservatives don't feel like they used to have power and they don't anymore. They feel like the country used to be more socially conservative and now it's not anymore. But all conservatives feel that way, whether they're these statist populists or the Frenchists. But the social conservatives feel like movement conservatism, like post-war, the fusionist coalition of social conservatives, Christian traditionalists, libertarians on economics, and cold warriors on foreign policy, that social conservatives lost out, that they were the middle child, the like least doted upon by the movement. I remember talking to somebody who was a National Review conservative who said that like it used to be that during the panels at National Review conferences, everybody who was a serious conservative would leave the room when they would do the panels about like social conservative goals. Like it was like they would do a lot on, the Reaganite economics, and everyone would be like, oh, this is really important and interesting. And then when the Christian freaks would do their thing, everyone wouldn't care. And that he was like, the bitterness about that is what's driving this internecine conflict. But I think that it's hard for us to see as leftists and liberals on the outside the degree to which the social conservatives, even within the conservative movement, feel that they have been, taken advantage of. And they think that actually their program is the one that appeals to the base.
Sometimes that's really overt, actually.
And it's not entirely wrong, right?
No, I'm not saying it is.
I think this is worth saying, right? Because it's like, I think sometimes people talk past each other about this because they have different like issues in mind, but like it is true. I think it's a good thing, right? But it is true that social conservatives have actually like lost an astonishing number of battles, right, in the last several decades. I think that's just true, right? Like they have like gay marriage was a huge issue for them, and they lost, and not only lost, but lost so thoroughly that like they don't even talk about it anymore outside of the kind of the fringes. It's like a little retro that Sohrah
coming back.
Yeah, it could be, right, but like but for the moment, right, like that they have a. Like the fact that there were these sort of battles about wedding cakes and stuff like that, like sort of it's sort of finding a new line of scrimmage, because like the original one about like allowing marriage, was lost, and you go back not that far further than that, and there are much more basic things that that they were fighting about. Again, I think this is good. I think it's progress, right? That they've lost all these battles, but it is definitely true they've lost, and it's also not entirely wrong that like a lot of their platform is what got a lot of the Republican base most excited historically, and that they were somewhat taken advantage of because like because the movers and shakers and
so many
movement
people
and,
vote for
yeah.
Republicans just on the choice issue, and
Right.
and that's it, But I think it's to be even more generous. And Ahmari, though, I don't even know how much he speaks to it in this debate, but like he writes about it all the time. He actually also suggests that the libertarian side of the ledger has gotten their way on the economics and welfare policies down the line, which he thinks that like a real, believing Christian would have to support, much more robust redistribution and welfare at a certain kind, of course, one that reifies a normative patriarchal family and so on and so on.
Sure.
But nonetheless, like that's also part of it, is like these Christian traditionalists, especially the Catholic ones, have a social teaching which is very concerned about the plight of the poor. And if you're Ahmari type conservative who believes that the state actually has something to do with legislating and sort of morality in the country, then that's why he supports like a more robust welfare state of a sort that we might be uncomfortable with, but nonetheless. And so that's the other part of it too. It's not just that they've lost the battles on the things that we're happy they lost, but obviously the libertarian side, which caters to capital, has carried the day in both parties.
No, I want to say that what you're describing is actually being quite astutely theorized on just right now. So Yoram Mazzoni, who's kind of one of the leaders of the national conservatism movement, of which all these members are part, has a new book that's coming out soon, Conservatism and Rediscovery, which I'm reading right now to review. And one of the things that he says is exactly what you said, Sam, which is that social conservatives around the 1950s were told that we're going to have a public liberalism and a private social conservatism, and this is a necessary compromise for us to win the Cold War. And then eventually this is more or less going to be dropped and we're going to have a public social conservatism, and they said that's never happened, right? We've carried on with the public liberalism. And if anything, the private social conservatism has retreated further and further and further. So there is this real sense of betrayal on the part of the fusionist movement and all of its other iterations, and this belief that we need a kind of theoretical rethinking of these things. Now, I mean, I don't agree with where they want to go with that, right? But I do think that there's some validity to that. If you look at somebody like, say, Frank Meyer, right, or the kind of fusionist movement, they did always foreground these kind of liberal approaches to things. So you can really see that with somebody like French, right?
Yeah, I mean, and I would say, look, Sam, you said this on Twitter, it seemed exactly right, that they have that if you're going to sign up for social democracy plus social conservatism, surely you should understand the American system is much more likely to, I don't know how likely it is to do either one, but it's certainly like the structural impediments to social conservatism are certainly a hell of a lot less, right? And that just seems obviously right. Like the kind of burden of the piece I wrote, Jack. I did find the graphic. This is it. Stop trying to make right-wing social democracy happen. It's not going to happen. But like the kind of the main argument of that piece.
I still do love that title.
Is that it's all Mike is. Is that the idea that you're going to get social democracy that's going to be delivered through social conservatives presumably operating through the Republican Party. Not the Democratic Party, right? So it's got to be the Republicans. Just seems like a total fantasy to me that they have the reason why we don't have social democracy in America is not because nobody's had the right thoughts in their head, right? It's because the working class has very little structural power. And it's just the idea that the Republican Party is going to be a vehicle for that just seems completely insane to me. If you think about how high the impediments are in the Democratic Party, the Republican Party is vastly more hostile terrain, right? And I think not to even speak of how the kind of divisiveness of that program, within the people that you're trying to reach, it would be the social base of an attempt to bring about all these redistribution economic policies. I just don't see any scenario where both can happen, which is why I find it very unsurprising that I think Sohrah Ahmari I think quite possibly really means it, right? Like that they like I think he quite possibly like really means what he says
I'm
about
sure
the
he was a
economic
sincere
stuff.
Trotskyist when he was in college, and now he's a sincere right.
Sure. You know, yeah.
I mean, I've often said the one kind of constant in his life and in the lives of people like him is that whatever critique of modernity they find themselves leaning towards, they're stalwartly illiberal, right?
Yeah. I mean, I was just, you know, like, okay, so he might mean it about the economic stuff, you know, Vermeil might mean it, you know, whatever. But like, I don't think it's just a weird coincidence that nobody means it who's like that there's nobody in Congress who means it, right? With that combination of views, that there aren't even like anybody who's like a sort of,
Yeah.
you know, major right-wing propagandist, not like a sort of somewhat boutique right-wing propagandist, right? But like a major right-wing propagandist. There aren't even any of those people who mean it. There's certainly nobody in Congress who means it, right? That they ever all the people who sort of talk that talk to a certain extent, right? I mean, like it's all like the economic aspect of it is all just completely empty. I mean, that's like you know, Marco Rubio has been, you know, trying to position himself that way for like, you know, 3 years now, and he finally comes up with this big pro worker piece of legislation. It's literally a law to legalize company unions, you know. I mean,
Yeah.
like, you know.
Well, I think there's an irony here that gets to some essential contradictions in this debate, which is that there's actually a problem if you build your political philosophy around enmity and taking no prisoners and never surrendering and never compromising, if you hope to use the American system to build a more robust welfare state. Because like, if you look at it, like all of these people say that we should do the child tax credit, like
Right.
not in Congress, but all of these populist, pro-Trump conservative intellectuals will say, of course we need to do that. But who's the guy who actually writes a good policy? It's Mitt Romney, right? He's the one saying like, why don't we all do this, you know? And Romney's the little wimpy, you know, compromiser, the cuck. And I think there's a thing here where the means don't totally match the ends, even in this very short-term way. Like, you can't maintain this politics of pure enmity if you want to, like, you know, put aside our differences of the far left and the far right in order to pass some good welfare stuff that we'd agree about, or like some tech, antitrust stuff. If we want to do any of the things where there actually is philosophical overlap between the right and the left, often it is the far right and the far left in terms of the legislative issues. It's like the classic like Freedom Caucus, Progressive Caucus issues, or like war too. Like, I think some of the stuff that happens more in the background, they actually are able to do it, like the War Powers Act stuff or surveillance stuff, but stuff people pay less attention to. But they'll never do this just pass an extension of the child tax credit, or pass the better one, which is Romney's, which is better, you know, than the one that was instantiated in law in the Rescue Act. Like, they won't do it because the like affective posture of the populist movement is the populist contingency in Congress and in the right is, you know, never surrender, never give an inch to the left. They'll take a mile. These people are our enemies. But you can't water that down. Yeah, no, I think that's probably right. And I should say too, like, to make sure everybody's really clear on the point here, right? It's like, obviously most politicians are full of shit in lots of ways. You know, there are, you know, numerous, you know, Democrats who have good rhetoric and, you know, and like helping workers, whatever, and it's not translated to anything. But like, also Bernie Sanders exists, right? Like, also, like, you know, a good smattering of people in Congress who like really do have strongly like left-wing economic, you know, perspectives really exist, who, you know, on the, you know, lefty side, that there is no Bernie Sanders for the strong social democratic state that defends community against the libertine left, right? You know, like there is nobody like that. And I think that's for, you know, these larger structural reasons, and maybe also for the rhetorical reason that Matt's talking about, that Sam is talking about.
I want to add one more thing, though, because I think actually Sam has hit on a pretty key point here, right? Which is that I do believe that a lot of these people are committed to a certain kind of welfareism, right? And again, you can see long arguments for that, going even back to the 19th century within the Catholic conservative tradition, right? Or even, within various forms of authoritarian conservatism in Europe, right? But there is a big difference, which is that their approach to redistribution is almost always parochial, even paternalistic, right? There's this idea that the good state is meant to care for all the members within it. And as Sam very artfully put it, it tends to the implication is that we're supposed to reify the various forms of social organization that we find to be morally apt through these kind of welfarist measures. The left has always justified redistribution on very different democratic lines. And it's worth noting that that's the singular thing that they all tend to avoid talking about in any substantially meaningful way. In Vermeule's case, he even says we shouldn't make a fetish out of democracy. And I think that's a really telling difference, because the kind of redistribution that we want on the left is things like workplace democracy, where workers get to have a say in how it is that firms are operated, redistribute things to the bottom. And the kind of meaning that you're supposed to find out of social life is meant to come through democratic procedures, dialogue, interaction. That's not the kind of approach to redistribution that you see on the right. And I think that's a fundamental philosophical difference that you're not likely to see overcome anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly, like, it's. Look, to my mind, the thing that's that's so objectionable, like, the point of left-wing economic policies is ultimately that it gives people a greater degree of control over their individual and collective destiny, right? That's like, so like having combining that, right, theoretically, in this fantasy world with social social reaction wouldn't be desirable in itself, right? I mean, like, it would, parts of it would be, right, but like it would be, but it would like really go against the point, right, which is actually thinking about. So when that Jackman article came out, I guess there was also at the same time there was an article about compacted reason, and Sohrah posted this on Twitter. It was left liberals and right liberals are mad at compact bag. Good, we're doing what we set out to do. Which I remember I kind of said at the time, like, is sort of like, okay, well, on the one hand, I'm sort of pissed off at being called a liberal, since like that has a set of connotations, that I don't, I don't like.
Embrace
right?
it, Ben. Embrace it, Ben. You're a liberal.
As a, it's like, I don't know. Last time I checked, I was, as a, Marxist of a squishy, Michael Harrington, Bhaskar Sankara sort of
a liberal.
way, but
a liberal. What you're describing is a liberal.
But I think that
don't let it go, Sam. Keep pressing.
I'm not going to.
I think in the way he means it, right? Like, yeah, I mean, I think pluralism is good. I think the separation of church and state is good. I think free speech is good, right? And so, like, I think in the way that he's using it, it might sort of fit. But in any case, let's we should probably watch some more of this.
Because I also know that my rights are fragile. And that there's going to come a time when I'm going to need some assistance in fighting for the rights that I would most like to exercise. And so when you say I'm going to defend the First Amendment, it is Con Law 101. It is Constitutional Ethics 101. That sometimes that means that people you don't agree with and people you don't like are going to have to go to court and win.
I think one problem is that too much of the intellectual firepower of the right has been focused on lawyers and litigation. Now,
and that's an easy
all those
win,
defensive battles, like I said in my piece, and I said just now, I applaud you, David, for fighting those. But often these things don't take place in a courtroom. What the sexual revolutionary left wants is not censorship. It wants self-censorship. It wants people who object to things like Drag Queen Story Hour, which, by the way, isn't akin to just a cult or a weird hotel. It's promoted by every kind of mainstream media power is behind it. So it's not quite that. And what they want is self-censorship and for people to just sort of take it. And that's what I would resist. And what I would say is that as much as it's valuable to fight things in the courtroom, there are cultural battles which can't be fought there, but must be fought there, because as far as I'm concerned, look, Christianity cannot be just a religion for an elite elect, where we create the most kind of degenerate society that throws every possible kind of obstacle in the way of a genuine kind of flourishing of religion, whether for Christians or others. Pornography, as running into our homes through our screens. My son, who's now 2.5 years old, statistically speaking, although I'll obviously do my best to avoid that, statistically speaking, he is likely to encounter hardcore pornography before he hits puberty. That's statistics. So the point is, we can't create an order in which all of that is facing the family, is facing true religion, and then say, oh, navigate this landmine and see if you're still among the elect at the end. Christianity is not just this private faith. It's also a peoplehood.
So
right?
hold on. All right. In the assault on David Frenchism, one of the core arguments you made against me was that I make too many cultural arguments.
No,
okay.
I'm saying...
And then you also said my calls for religious revival or renewal are little more than idle wishes that men would be moral.
Yep.
That's a call.
I stand with that.
I've spent much of my life not just arguing that we need to have a legal space, but then arguing that we have to have the courage to walk into that space and proudly, boldly, and with great grace and compassion and humility present the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's a both and. It is not, you don't win anything if you just win in court and then you're too timid to occupy that ground and to speak boldly. I made that very argument, and then all of a sudden I hear, no, that's too much to ask.
No, I'm not talking about your cultural arguments. I'm saying we need a state and a public order that supports the flourishing of religion, right? It means not just that we as Christians go out there and present our courageous witness, which we should, but Christianity, look, in the first century or so after Christ, Christianity was primarily an elite phenomenon and some ragtag bands and people that puzzled the Romans. It was only after the Constantinian conversion, right, that the average Roman cobbler could think to himself as becoming a Christian. Now, was he as dedicated as that first, second, third generation of Christians? Did he understand every aspect of the creeds and so forth? Not necessarily, but he still got some benefit from it, and the order that was created was decent.
So you used the language of culture a minute ago, but fundamentally, Ahmariism claims that there has been insufficient attention paid to the influence of state power on culture, right?
And I don't just, by the way, I don't just mean this LGBTQ stuff, which are the most hot button things, or pornography, but other dimensions of life as well. I mean, you've talked about this as well, Ross. Just the degree of insecurity that's built into American life, right? For you and I, David, we can have our castles, right? You can pay for a $30,000 a year, or whatever, classical Christian school. I can send my kid to a Catholic school, and I can do my best. Even if the Catholic school, if he comes home and says, Dad, which one of the 57 genders am I can take that up with the Archbishop. I can take it up with the Archdiocese. I can take it up to Rome all the way and protect my own kid. But for the average person who first of all works 2 jobs, if they get sick, there's a chance they might be hit with a $10,000 cash bill, even if they have insurance and so forth. The whole order seems geared toward making it impossible for a kind of Christian peoplehood or religious peoplehood to flourish, except for elites who happen to live in thick religious communities and they can afford it, and gated communities and so forth. But I'm talking about my own real life in New York City. I mean, all these people live profoundly difficult lives, and whether they send their kids voluntarily to Drag Queen Story Hour or not, it is immaterial. It's not the real world. So,
I guess I'm going to press David in a minute, but I'm going to press you right now. It seems to at least some observers of this debate that having lost a succession of cultural battles, including arguably the battle over whether Drag Queen Story Hours are appropriate for children, that younger conservative Catholics and Christians generally, and I'm sure there are quite a few in this room here tonight who are sympathetic to your argument, have sort of come around to the idea that, well, we couldn't solve the smaller problem, so let's make the problem bigger, right? Because I think when David presses you on what specifically you want to do about, you know, a specific objectionable cultural practice, the narrative, the argument is, there's a lot of space between have Josh Hawley hold a hearing and build a conservative Christian republic, right? And I think a lot of people reasonably ask, well, what is the interstitial activity, and how is it remotely more plausible than David's use of the existing liberal order to defend Christian practice, insufficient as in certain ways that might be?
Look, as a stopgap measure, we see a lot of Christians and others, middle-class people, working-class people, have at least found in the politics of populism a kind of protection against some of these forces,
Have they?
Yes.
Oh, explain that.
In the sense that, for example, we have...
They found some enthusiasm for a while, but concrete protection from these forces.
Yes, I mean, judicial appointments under this presidency. And this has been first of all, I mean, if you think about life as the most important value, its foundational value, this really has been the most pro-life administration since Roe. And David, you're on the record saying we need to defeat Trump at the ballot box. You wrote that in the Time column a couple of times.
Oh, I've said that so many times.
Sure, but hold on. But that would mean plausibly a Senator Bernie Sanders, who today, or was it yesterday, suggested that one of the world's problems is that too many poor people are having children. And so, we should promote contraception and abortion and do away with the Mexico City rule. So look, as a baseline matter, when voters are standing up against this overweening, totalizing kind of liberalism that I'm talking about, you would have them settle for Bernie. What would Bernie's judicial appointments look like?
So I know a little bit about the judiciary, and one of the things that I know and I understand is that the advances that we have made in the First Amendment and religious liberty in this country, which have been pretty stunning. In the early 1980s, a lot of people don't realize this. It was an absolute open question as to whether or not a religious student group could use an empty classroom at a public university to hold a meeting. That was an open question. The question was, would that violate the Establishment Clause for a public university to provide an empty classroom? That was one. I can go down the line for 35 years in front of Republican appointees and Democratic appointees and chronicle the advance of individual liberty in the First Amendment over a 30 plus year span of time. A remarkable achievement in clearing the way almost all the time for
if you're a young radical conservative, you're just
delivering messages.
It's cope. He's just doing cope. It's cope. Like, no, we haven't been winning. We've been losing. Don't lie to me, David French. I feel like that's really the truth.
Yeah. No. And, as we discussed, kind of fair enough.
Yeah. I think we should talk about, because Ahmari really articulated more of the substantive vision of why you need, a public morality, like why you need a Christian state. In that exchange. So I thought maybe we could talk about that. I also this debate kind of just goes around in circles. So I have to leave relatively soon. And so I would like to talk more rather than watch it more.
Yeah. Fair.
Absolutely. I mean, what I always find most interesting about these debates in post-liberal spaces is probably two things, right? One is that there's a real disinterest, for the most part, in the kind of metaphysical or ontotheological speculation or philosophizing that you would think would be necessary to kind of validate their moral viewpoint. especially because a lot of the figures that they point to, people like St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, that was precisely what was emblematic of their work. And I think this is kind of the weirdest feature of this kind of post-liberal movement, and you can trace this all the way back to somebody like Alistair McIntyre, who's like the major intellectual mouthpiece of it, is the fact that they concede so much to modern intellectual trends, because the only kind of arguments that they typically make for their position substantively are functionalist arguments, right? That society needs this glue to hold it together. Otherwise, we have nihilism, fray, decay. And if that's glue needs to be Catholic integralism and the beliefs associated with that, then so be it. But you never see them actually argue, not very frequently at least, for the metaphysical basis of that kind of position. And I think that's really telling of kind of what Sam was talking about, right? Just intellectually also how far they've felt like they've had to retreat. Because if you actually were trying to vindicate this in any kind of substantive way, the way that, say, somebody like John Finnis does, you'd risk being laughed out of the intellectual sphere, because people would say you're making all these kind of wacky metaphysical claims about the existence of God and then about the existence of a Christian God. There's just no way to kind of make that salient to a modernist audience. So they turn to these kind of functionalist positions instead.
Well, they're talking to each other in this moment. I mean, let's keep in mind with this debate, they're at Catholic University. They're speaking to their co-religionists. I mean, I guess French is not a Catholic; he's a Baptist of some sort, I think. Yeah. But they're speaking to fellow Christians and to fellow conservatives, and so there's a sort of agreed upon metaphysics. There's an agreed upon moral aim. Like the ground in which this debate takes is that, like, in fact, Christianity is true. And but the place where there is a sort of occluded, actually serious philosophical debate is the question about, one of you guys talked about this earlier, but it was a debate that was very live amongst the National Review set in the immediate kind of, the early years of the magazine, which is like, if Christian morality is enforced by authoritarian means, does that generate a moral society, or does that generate if people are not choosing to be moral, is that actually morality in a Christian idiom? So that's a theological debate. And I think that French very explicitly makes the argument that, like, no, it would not be. We must. Our Christian witness consists of making the case for, the attractiveness, the moral righteousness and beauty of the Christian faith. But if the state enforces it, that's a violation not just of liberalism, but of his conception of Christian morality. Whereas Ahmari's position is not that at all. We must make it easy for people to be virtuous. We must create robust material conditions and carrots and sticks, right, to make people.
Which there is a version of that that's like, I mean, that's Dorothy Day, right? I mean, we want a society where it's easier to be good. And there's like a way of reading that's like, you want a society where people aren't like doing really horrible, immoral things because they have to survive, and turning to crime and etc. But of course, obviously in the Ahmari version, I mean, he, as vague as it all is, right? I mean, there's nothing that reordering the public square around the highest good could possibly mean that doesn't involve some level of authoritarian enforcement of Christian personal morality.
Well, right. I want to say, just to Sam's point, it's really funny you mentioned this, because one of the initial article that kind of got me involved in those Sohrah Ahmari ones, again, relied very heavily on Kierkegaard, who had this famous claim that if you try to make the way easier to Christianity, what you wind up isn't with a Christian society, it's with an anti-Christian society that kind of goes through the simulacra of being a Christian society. So he said the way can never be made easier and must always be made harder. And one of the interesting kind of inside baseball points that I sometimes make on this is that I really think that Charles Taylor, who's a kind of good left Christian commentator in the United States, his criticism of people like McIntyre, Deneen, all of them, is really devastating, where he points out that if you kind of impose this hegemonic moral viewpoint using state institutions, what you're going to get is not a spiritually dynamic, robust society, but instead just a bunch of people who feel compelled to go through the motions of spirituality in order to maintain the social glue that you think is so important. And you see arguments that to this effect all the time. Again, think about like somebody like Yoram Hazony, He wrote a piece called Against Conservative Rationalism, where he said, look, even if you don't believe in the religious viewpoints of your nation, you should still act as though you do, because it's so necessary that you hold to these religious beliefs, or at least act as if you do, in order to provide this kind of substantialist glue. And I think that Taylor's point is really devastating to that. Is that really what any kind of real believer would want? A bunch of people going through the motions of what's ultimately supposed to be a kind of spiritual exercise? I would say no.
Well, the classic response to that argument in Christian theology is that if in kind of like Christian political theology is if you think that the truest manifestation, truest expression of faith is believing despite authoritarian, despite it being hard, despite the authoritarian effort to not allow you to believe, then shouldn't people who hope for Christian transcendence and morality to flourish support a completely secular state, a state that makes it hard to believe?
Well, I would.
Yeah, should they support Stalinism?
I support that way.
You know,
there's a classic argument in the early, I don't remember, I think it was Bozell and Meyer arguing about this, where Meyer is saying like, well, no, we must, people must have the freedom to choose virtue. And Bozell said, well, if it's more valuable if you choose virtue despite the odds, then we should just make it hard to choose virtue.
Right.
That was his reductio ad absurdum.
That might be a more fun society.
To make the odds longer. I mean, I will also say, like, I think there is, I think there is like a not crazy answer, from like a Christian theological perspective. That's like okay, like Pascal, like when he's laying out, his wager, right? He has this passage where it's like there's this obvious response, like wait a second, how can you just choose what to believe, right? Is that how beliefs work, right? That you could just like will yourself to believe something, and he's not an idiot. He says no, right? Clearly it's not how it works, but basically, if you surround yourself with like going to church all the time and reading the Bible all the time and praying all the time, it's a lot more likely that genuine faith will flower in that environment than, if you're just like hanging out and living your life and, whatever, hanging out at like, gambling dens and whorehouses and like, all the time, right? Like, it's probably a lot more likely. The real thing is going to be more likely to come in that environment. And it could, I think like somebody with the Ahmari kind of position, like I'd say, yeah, I mean, like it could be that that if people aren't, they're not accessing, porn on the internet, like there's no porn to access on the internet, and there are no, there are no values that run counter to theirs that are, sort of like on the market or whatever, that won't, of course, force everybody to have a genuine, well. I mean, I also think that this might be a place where the Catholic-Protestant distinction becomes relevant, right? Because
that's also a submerged aspect of this debate, right?
Yeah.
This is a Protestant and a Catholic, and they don't really, Douthit in the beginning, like sort of gestures to that, but they don't actually make it text. It's all subtext.
Yeah, because like David French is talking about whether you have a personal relationship to Jesus, and that's and like. Yeah, if that's your, if that's like what your theology is all about, that makes it like a little bit easier to make sense in the David French combination of positions, whereas the idea that, there's this sort of natural order of things that that does have a legitimate political component and, and all this stuff. I mean, this is like at the very, obviously there are, there are many, many, many Catholics who do not have this conception of any of this, but it is also a conception that has like, pretty deep roots and like, centuries of Catholic political theory.
Yeah, and I would just say, I tend to think that the voluntarist argument actually is more powerful than the kind of social conformity one, in part because even if you look at someone like Pascal, right, he says that these are exercises you're supposed to fulfill in order to integrate yourself into the spiritual relationship with God. So, he says famously, you should sit down and pray, and even if you don't believe, eventually belief will come, right? There's never really this kind of overweening argument that the state should compel you to believe or act as though you believe, and then that will come, right? But I just kind of want to return very briefly to the point about the kind of metaphysical disputes. And I agree that the Catholic Protestant distinction here is actually really important in understanding the variances between these two positions, because I think that, again, what I was trying to get at with this point is if you look at a lot of this kind of post-liberal literature, with a handful of exceptions, people like James Matthew Wilson, you really very rarely see them actually try to confront modernity and its kind of scientific modernity and scientific materialism in any robust sense of the word, by saying that scientific materialism is just false from an epistemological and ontological perspective. And here's a constructive, systematic argument as to why we should go back and what the alternative can be. Usually the argument that's typically made is that scientific materialism and this kind of political outlook, liberalism, leads to nihilistic, terrible moral results. And that invalidates it. And it's why we need to return to this kind of Christian outlook. And of course, all you really need to do to refute that is by saying, look, an ontological perspective may result in all these really bad moral outcomes. That doesn't mean it's wrong, right? We might just happen to live in an awful materialistic, godless universe, and that's just the kind of universe we live in. But I think, again, there's this real anxiety about going too far and trying to confront the kind of metaphysical basis of modernity, even though that's absolutely necessary in the long run for their intellectual project to succeed. And I'm really curious to see if somebody actually tries that in the future, because from my mind, it's been a really long time since, like, Vogelin, since you've gotten a conservative take this really giant stab at trying to do something like that. And it was pretty wacky last time. So I'm almost looking forward to seeing it come again.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. A philosopher of history for our time of the right. I think one thing that is hard to understand, first of all, if you're a leftist, and second of all, if you're secular, and even if you're not Catholic, but really if you're secular, the thing is that these people believe that religious belief and sort of being saved and having a relationship with Christ is a high good, one of the highest goods. You know, it's what gives their lives meaning, and what's what they think that no life has, you know, really robust meaning without it. And so therefore, this is why the material and spiritual dimensions of this politics are totally interconnected, because the redistribution of material wealth is actually conflated with the redistribution of the ease with which one can experience spiritual redemption. So it's, for Ahmari, it's both the case that we must create the conditions for spiritual redemption to be easy or easier, you know, so that his son doesn't become a porn addicted, polyamorist. But
somebody in the chat was like, you know, I hope in 10 years, Sohrah Ahmari's son is thralling one out in the bathroom watching as much gay porn.
Gay porn, yeah. Yeah.
So cheers to whoever said that.
But also that that there's actually, it's not like it's like, okay, we should do this material redistribution, and then also at the same time we should hope that people become Christian. It's like our desire for these people who we imagine to be our constituency or the members of our movement or the public, the American public, we want for them in equal measure material, you know, comfort, not suffer, but also that not suffering requires that they be Christian. Like that is not it, there's obviously in its effect it becomes authoritarian, but from their perspective it's like this is the way to a robust, fulfilling, the only way to a robust, fulfilling, meaningful, morally serious life. And so, you know, giving people the way that the left, we just think like we must give people the minimal conditions in order to make, you know, to create the life that is meaningful to them, to do that kind of, you know, self discovery that is the substance of life. All of that doesn't matter to them. It's like we must just make people be able to find Christ, and if they don't do that, then they're suffering, you know. And so I don't know if that's it's not an argument. It's not an argument for sympathy with the argument, because I'm not Christian at all. Sure. I just think that's all bullshit. But I do think that it's helpful to understand why these authoritarian means could be justified in their conception, because it's actually and why you can't just sideline the Christian culture part in favor of the material part. Like why they can't be like, okay, we like Bernie. It's too bad that he's so pro-abortion. No.
Yeah.
Like that is spiritual violence against yourself if you support abortion. And so you have to do both. It has to be one all together at the same time.
Yeah, I had kind of forgotten, by the way, like when I looked it up, I realized I vaguely remembered it, but I had completely forgotten about the Bernie thing they mentioned in the debate, and I looked that up a minute ago. I do think this might have actually been Bernie taking message discipline too far, because he does the thing that he does a lot, which is that he's asked a question and he sort of identifies it at the sort of core policy position that he wants to defend, and so he just pivots to talking about the policy position and ignores the rest of the question, which is actually not a bad strategy in general, for somebody in his position. But every once in a while, it would actually be good to like come out and explicitly say, just to be clear, I don't actually endorse the premise of your question. And this is one of them, like that the questioner asked him something. The questioner said some stuff about overpopulation and whatnot, and like linked it to abortion. He didn't get into the overpopulation part. He's just like, yeah, I support a woman's right to choose.
He's also of a generation where that kind of sentiment amongst like environmentalists and liberals was much less stigmatized and more widespread. The idea of that was much more normal. Whereas we now, hopefully, we all agree that that's messed up.
I wanted to say something just riffing off of what Sam said, because I think that point about the eschatological dimension of this project being very important is absolutely key. And I think it's really key to understanding also why there's an anti-democratic component to this built into its core. Because again, to the left, these kind of redistributive movements do have a democratic quality to them in the sense that we're all equal, and people need different resources to pursue their various plans or conceptions of the good life, to use a classical Rawlsian term, right? Now, this isn't the place to defend that, but to them, this kind of democratic quality is entirely absent. You might need certain kinds of resources in order to lead a life of flourishing, but the ultimate end of that flourishing is the pursuit of this spiritual project that we know in advance to be correct and isn't really subject to democratic deliberation, or at least shouldn't be, right? So there's a real profound philosophical difference there. Even if on the surface of it, you might say, well, Hungary has some fairly decent welfare programs. Bernie proposed some fairly diced welfare programs also. What's really the difference between the two of them?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, although also, I do want to insist here that like Hungary, as welfare states go, Hungary's nothing to write home about. Which is not a irrelevant point here, because I mean, I think it does, I think it does go to how meager, that's the.
Sorry.
Yeah, there's always a question of like how if you have to choose between the authoritarian elements and the alleviating material suffering elements, it often just seems like let's go with the authoritarianism. Like the compromise is always of the material redistribution part and not of the authoritarian control part.
Yeah, and like, look, I mean, as conservatives have been pointed out for decades now, like there is it's not a coincidence that like these Nordic countries that have incredibly expansive, welfare state, like also have, greater gender equality and, and more of a, lots of people who are living outside traditional norms, et cetera. You're right. Like there is a version of this that's an argument that conservatives love, that's the thing about the, because of these damn great society programs, that means that like, women don't like have as much economic incentive, to stay with their husbands or partners. And so this has led to the breakdown of family and society and, whatever, and like there's a real insight there, right? Which is that it is actually not wrong, right? That more state support makes people more free to do whatever they want with their lives, which is a good thing.
Right.
Yeah,
Well, what's interesting. I was just going to say, what's interesting about this moment is that, for a long time, it was conservatives making the argument that too much welfare undermines the social conservative aims and ends. Now you have people like Ahmari arguing that not enough welfare undermines the conservative social ends. And I think that one of the things, that we would have to look out for is like if for some reason we did get closer to some minimal form of social democracy, and I think that it probably would generate quite a lot of like new forms of freedom that would be disconcerting to the Ahmaris of the world, would they still be doing this flirtation with like labor and redistribution? At that point, maybe they would be like, no, we just need the authoritarian stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that's exactly right. All right, so I know Sam has to go, so I want to wrap this up. So I will, well, Matt, I will see you actually in person in less than a week. So
Prepare your liver, Ben.
I'm doing my best. So I've got so yeah, anybody who's in Toronto, yeah, doing an event for the Hitchens book on next Thursday at the Duke of York pub at 7, and then the next day on Friday giving a philosophy talk at Ryerson. It's currently still known as Ryerson at 6:30. So we'll put the links to both of those in there. You should if you so you should watch, listen to Matt at Plastic Pills and read him. He has not updated his website in a very long time, so I just used the page of his Jacobin articles as the link in the
Probably wise.
in the description here. But Matt is absurdly prolific. You should check his stuff out there. Sam writes for many places. You should, New Republic was already mentioned, etc. Should check all that out. Also, if you want to hear, as I did last night, about William F. Buckley tripping acid with James Burnham, you should listen to Know Your Enemy. That is a real thing that was mentioned in that episode. So, thanks, guys.
Thanks. This was really fun.
Yeah, it was.
Great talking to you guys.
All right, thanks.